A gunshot echoed through the dusty streets of Silverton, Colorado, as Madeline Turner ducked behind a water trough, her heart pounding wildly against her ribs. It wasn't supposed to be like this. Coming west to escape her old life in Boston hadn't included dodging bullets on a sweltering afternoon in the summer of 1883. The sound of spurs jangling made her press herself tighter against the weathered wood as a pair of worn leather boots stopped directly in front of her hiding place. "Madam, unless you're planning on becoming friends with those tadpoles, you might want to find better cover," came a deep voice, tinged with amusement despite the chaos. Madeline looked up, squinting against the bright Colorado sun to see a tall figure looming above her. He wore a dark hat pulled low over piercing hazel eyes, his face partially obscured by several days' worth of stubble. His stance was relaxed, despite the gunfire that had just erupted down the street. "I wasn't expecting a shootout when I stepped out for supplies," Madeline replied, adjusting her skirts with as much dignity as she could muster while crouched behind a horse trough. The stranger extended a calloused hand. "Yates Prescott. And that ruckus is just Miller and Jenkins settling a disagreement over a card game. Happens about once a month." Madeline hesitated before taking his hand, allowing him to help her to her feet. "Madeline Turner. I'm new to town." "I gathered as much," Yates replied, the corner of his mouth lifting in a half-smile. "Folks round here know to stay indoors when those two start drinking before noon." Madeline brushed the dirt from her skirts, acutely aware of how different she must look from the local women. Her dress, while practical by Boston standards, was still too formal for the frontier town. Her chestnut hair was pinned neatly beneath a modest hat, though several strands had escaped during her dive for cover. "Well, Mr. Prescott, thank you for your assistance, but I should be going. I have errands to finish." She straightened her spine, lifting her chin slightly. "Those errands might have to wait, Miss Turner. Sheriff's likely to keep everyone off the street until those fools run out of ammunition or patience." Yates gestured toward the saloon across the way. "Might I suggest waiting it out over there? Coffee's decent if nothing else." Madeline hesitated. Back east, no respectable woman would enter such an establishment unescorted, but she was quickly learning that the rules were different here. After a moment's consideration, she nodded. "Very well, Mr. Prescott. Lead the way." Yates guided her across the street, maintaining a respectful distance while positioning himself between her and the distant commotion. Inside the saloon, the air was thick with tobacco smoke and the murmurs of the other townsfolk who had sought refuge from the altercation outside. The barkeep nodded at Yates as they entered. "The usual, Prescott." "Just coffee for me and the lady, Hank," Yates replied, guiding Madeline to a small table near the window. As they sat down, Madeline noticed several curious glances cast their way. She straightened her posture, determined not to show any discomfort. "So what brings you to Silverton, Miss Turner?" Yates asked as Hank brought over 2 steaming mugs. Madeline wrapped her fingers around the warm ceramic. "I've come to take over my uncle's property. He passed away last month." "Samuel Turner's place." Yates raised his eyebrows. "That's a fair piece of land. You planning to sell it?" "No," Madeline replied firmly. "I intend to run it myself." Yates nearly choked on his coffee. "Begging your pardon, madam, but that's no small undertaking for anyone, let alone a woman," Madeline finished for him, her green eyes flashing. "I'm well aware of the challenges, Mr. Prescott. But I've spent the last 3 years helping manage my father's shipping business. I'm quite capable of learning what I need to know." Yates studied her for a long moment, taking in her determined expression and the set of her jaw. "I don't doubt your intelligence, Miss Turner, but ranching is different from shipping. It's physical work from sunup to sundown, and these parts can be dangerous." "I'm not afraid of hard work, Mr. Prescott," Madeline said, meeting his gaze steadily. "And as for danger, I grew up navigating Boston's docks and warehouses. I'm not as delicate as I might appear." A faint smile played at Yates's lips. "No, I don't suppose you are." The sound of boots on the wooden floor drew their attention as Sheriff Davis entered the saloon, removing his hat as he approached their table. "Afternoon, Yates, madam." He nodded politely to Madeline. "Those fools are sleeping it off in my jail now. Streets are safe again, such as they are." "Appreciate the update, Sheriff," Yates replied. "This here is Miss Madeline Turner, Samuel's niece from back east. She's taking over his property." The sheriff's bushy eyebrows shot up. "Is that so? Well, miss, your uncle was a good man. Sorry for your loss." He shifted uncomfortably. "But I feel obliged to mention that his place has been sitting empty for a spell now. Might need some attention before it's livable again." "Thank you for your concern, Sheriff," Madeline replied. "I'll manage." After the sheriff departed, Madeline finished her coffee and rose to leave. "Thank you for the coffee, Mr. Prescott, but I really must complete my errands before the stores close." Yates stood as well. "Miss Turner, if you don't mind my asking, do you have any help lined up for the ranch?" Madeline hesitated. "Not yet. I plan to assess the property first, then determine what assistance I might need." Old Samuel had 2 hands working for him, brothers named Cartwright. Good men, but they moved on after he passed. "You'll need help, especially with winter coming in a few months." "Are you offering your services, Mr. Prescott?" Madeline asked, surprised. Yates adjusted his hat. "I know the property well. Used to help Samuel during calving season. I've got my own small spread to the north, but I could spare some time to get you settled." Madeline considered the offer. Having someone who knew the land would be invaluable, but she was wary of becoming dependent on anyone. "I appreciate the offer, Mr. Prescott. Perhaps we could discuss terms tomorrow. I'd like to see the property first." "Fair enough." He touched the brim of his hat. "I can meet you at the general store tomorrow morning, say around 8. We can ride out together." "That would be acceptable." Madeline extended her hand formally. "Until tomorrow, then." As Yates shook her hand, Madeline couldn't help noticing the warmth of his calloused palm against her skin. There was something reassuring about his quiet confidence, though she reminded herself that in Silverton, she couldn't afford to trust too quickly. The next morning dawned clear and cool, with the promise of heat later in the day. Madeline had spent the night at the town's only hotel, a modest establishment with clean but sparse rooms. She dressed carefully in the most practical clothes. She had brought a simple blouse and a dark skirt that wouldn't show too much dust. After a brief breakfast, she made her way to the general store. Yates was already waiting outside, holding the reins of 2 horses, his own chestnut gelding and a gentle-looking bay mare. "Morning, Miss Turner," he greeted, touching the brim of his hat. "Hope you don't mind, but I figured you might need a mount. This is Daisy. She's steady and patient, perfect for someone who might be out of practice." "Thank you, Mr. Prescott." Madeline approached the mare, stroking her velvety nose. "But I should warn you, I'm quite comfortable on horseback. My father insisted I learn properly, not just to ride side saddle for show." Yates's eyebrows rose slightly. "Is that so? Well, Daisy will still suit you fine. She's gentle but has spirit when needed." Madeline gathered her skirts and mounted with practiced ease, settling into the western saddle without difficulty. Yates watched her with newfound respect before mounting his own horse. "Your uncle's place is about 5 miles southeast of town," he explained as they rode out. "Follows the river a ways, which is why it's good grazing land. Samuel was smart when he claimed it back in '68. As they rode, Madeline took in the landscape around her, the rugged mountains rising in the distance, the swaying grasslands interspersed with clusters of pine and aspen. It was beautiful in a wild, untamed way that stirred something deep within her. "It's different from Massachusetts," she commented. "Bigger somehow. Like the sky goes on forever." Yates glanced at her. "Gets in your blood, this country, makes it hard to leave once you've truly seen it." "Is that what happened to you?" Madeline asked. "You don't sound like you're from around here originally." "Good ear. I came from Tennessee after the war, needed somewhere new, somewhere a man could build something without the ghosts of the past looking over his shoulder." "And did you find that?" "Peace." Yates was quiet for a moment, his eyes scanning the horizon. "Most days." They rode in comfortable silence after that until they crested a small rise and Yates pulled his horse to a stop. "There it is, Turner Ranch." Below them stretched a modest valley, bisected by a winding stream. A weathered but solid-looking cabin sat near a stand of cottonwood trees, surrounded by several outbuildings. In the distance, Madeline could see fenced pastures and the dark shapes of cattle grazing. "It's beautiful," she breathed, genuinely moved by the sight. "It's got potential," Yates agreed. Samuel ran about 60 head of cattle. Not the biggest operation, but the land's good and the water's reliable. He was starting to build a real business here before his heart gave out. They rode down to the cabin, and Madeline felt a strange mixture of excitement and trepidation as they dismounted. This would be her home now, a place so vastly different from the brick townhouse in Boston, where she'd grown up. The cabin door creaked as Yates pushed it open. Inside, dust motes danced in the sunlight streaming through the windows. The furnishings were simple but sturdy: a table with 4 chairs, a cookstove, shelves lined with books and supplies, and doors leading to what Madeline presumed were bedrooms. "It needs a good cleaning," she observed, running a finger along the dusty table, "but it's well built." "Samuel was particular about his home," Yates said, a note of fondness in his voice. "Used to say a man's house should outlast him." Madeline moved to the window, looking out at the land that was now hers. "Mr. Prescott, I want to be honest with you. I know very little about cattle ranching specifically, but I'm a quick learner and I'm not afraid of hard work." Yates leaned against the doorframe, studying her. "If you don't mind my asking, Miss Turner, why take this on? Surely you had a comfortable life back east." Madeline was quiet for a moment, considering how much to share with this man she barely knew. "My father remarried after my mother died. His new wife made it clear there was no place for me in the family business once she had sons of her own. When I received news of Uncle Samuel's passing and his bequest, it seemed like Providence, a fresh start." Yates nodded, understanding. "Exactly. I may not know much about ranching, but I understand business and I'm determined to make this work." "Well, determination counts for a lot out here." Yates straightened up. "Should we check the rest of the property? Best to know what you're dealing with before making any plans." They spent the next several hours touring the ranch. The barn needed some repairs, but was structurally sound. The corral fencing required attention in places. The cattle, a mix of Herefords and Longhorns, seemed healthy enough, though Yates noted they would need to be brought in closer before winter. By midday, they had covered most of the property, and Madeline's mind was swimming with information about stock rotation, water rights, and the dozens of tasks that would need attention in the coming weeks. "It's a lot to take in," Yates acknowledged as they shared a simple lunch of bread and dried beef near the stream. "But you don't have to do everything at once." Madeline sighed, removing her hat to fan herself in the midday heat. "I know. But winter will be here before we know it, according to what everyone tells me. I need to be prepared." "You'll need help," Yates said matter-of-factly. "At least 2 hands to manage the cattle properly, especially with Roundup coming in fall." And where does one find reliable ranch hands in Silverton? There are a few good men looking for work. I can ask around. Yates hesitated. In the meantime, I could help you get started. My place is small enough that my foreman can handle things for a spell. Madeline studied him. That's very generous, Mr. Prescott. But I wonder, why are you going out of your way to help me? We're practically strangers. Yates was quiet for a moment, his gaze on the distant mountains. Your uncle was good to me when I first came to these parts. Taught me a lot about ranching in this territory. He looked back at her. Besides, neighbors help neighbors out here. It's how we all survive. There was something in his tone, a sincerity that Madeline wasn't accustomed to from the businessmen of Boston. She found herself believing him. Very well, Mr. Prescott. I accept your offer of assistance, and I insist on paying you fairly for your time. Yates smiled. We can work out the details later. For now, let's figure out what needs doing first to make this place livable for you. They spent the rest of the afternoon making plans. The cabin needed cleaning and minor repairs. The barn roof had a leak that would need patching before the fall rains. Fences needed mending, and the cattle would need to be counted and assessed. By the time they rode back toward town in the golden light of late afternoon, Madeline felt both overwhelmed and strangely exhilarated. This new life would be challenging, but for the first time in years, she felt a sense of purpose, a feeling that her future was truly her own. I'll be by tomorrow with supplies, Yates said as they reached the hotel. We can start with the cabin first. Make sure you've got a proper place to sleep. Madeline dismounted, handing Daisy's reins back to him. Thank you, Mr. Prescott. I appreciate your help more than I can say. He tipped his hat, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. See you tomorrow, Miss Turner. As she watched him ride away, Madeline couldn't help but feel that meeting Yates Prescott might have been the first stroke of good fortune in her new life in Silverton. True to his word, Yates arrived early the next morning with a wagon loaded with supplies, lumber for repairs, cleaning materials, tools, and even some basic foodstuffs. I hope you don't mind, he said as he helped Madeline into the wagon, but I took the liberty of asking Mrs. Coleman from the boarding house to come out and help with the cleaning. She'll be following along shortly with her daughter. That's thoughtful, thank you, Madeline replied, genuinely relieved at the prospect of help with the dusty cabin. The next several days fell into a rhythm. Madeline and Mrs. Coleman attacked the interior of the cabin with brooms, mops, and determination, while Yates set about repairing the roof and broken window frames. By the end of the week, the cabin was transformed clean, weathertight, and beginning to feel like a home. Mrs. Coleman had brought curtains she'd sewn from simple cotton fabric, and they softened the windows remarkably. The old furniture had been polished, the floors scrubbed, and the pantry stocked with essentials. Madeline even discovered her uncle's small collection of books, which included several volumes on cattle ranching that she immediately began studying in the evenings. As Madeline settled into the cabin, Yates introduced her to the essentials of ranch management. He showed her how to check the cattle for signs of illness, explained the seasonal rhythms of ranching in Colorado, and began teaching her to use the tools she would need. On a particularly warm afternoon, they were mending a section of fence on the north pasture when Madeline paused, wiping sweat from her brow with her sleeve. How am I doing, Mr. Prescott? Honestly. Yates looked up from the post hole he was digging. Better than I expected, if I'm being truthful. That doesn't sound like overwhelming praise, she noted wryly. He chuckled. It's meant to be. Most folks from cities come out here with romantic notions about frontier life. First blister sends them packing. He nodded toward her hands, which were developing calluses despite the gloves she wore. You haven't complained once. I told you I'm not afraid of hard work. So you did. He drove the shovel into the dirt with a decisive thrust. "You're a surprising woman, Miss Turner." "I suppose I should take that as a compliment," she replied, handing him the new fence post. It was meant as one. Their fingers brushed as he took the post from her, and Madeline felt an unexpected warmth rise to her cheeks. Over the next few weeks, Madeline grew more confident in her abilities. She learned to ride the boundaries of her property, checking fences and cattle. She practiced with a rifle until she could hit targets consistently, a necessary skill for protecting livestock from predators. She even mastered the art of building and maintaining a fire in the cook stove, producing increasingly edible meals. Yates was a patient teacher, never condescending or impatient. He simply demonstrated skills and then allowed her to practice, offering guidance only when needed. His quiet confidence in her abilities bolstered Madeline's determination on days when the tasks seemed overwhelming. They were returning from checking the southern pasture one evening in early September, when a distant rumble of thunder caught their attention. The sky to the west had darkened ominously. "We'd better hurry," Yates said, glancing at the approaching storm. "That looks like it could be a gully washer." They urged their horses into a trot, but the storm moved faster than anticipated. By the time they reached the cabin, fat raindrops were already beginning to fall, quickly increasing to a downpour. "Get inside," Yates called over the wind as they dismounted. "I'll see to the horses." "I can help," Madeline insisted, already leading Daisy toward the barn. Yates looked like he might argue, but another crack of thunder made the decision for them. Together, they hurried the horses into the barn, quickly removing saddles and bridles. By the time they finished, both were soaked to the skin. "We won't make it back to the cabin without getting even wetter," Yates observed, looking out at the sheets of rain lashing the yard. "Might as well wait it out a bit." Madeline nodded, suddenly aware of how her wet blouse clung to her frame. She crossed her arms over her chest, grateful for the dimness of the barn. Yates, seemingly oblivious to her discomfort, busied himself checking that the barn roof wasn't leaking. Satisfied, he returned to where Madeline stood near the horses. "Here," he said, shrugging out of his coat and offering it to her despite its dampness. "You're shivering." "Thank you." She accepted the coat, wrapping it around her shoulders. It was still warm from his body and smelled of leather, tobacco, and something distinctly masculine that made her pulse quicken. They settled on a bench near the tack room, listening to the rain pound on the roof. The storm had brought an early dusk, throwing the barn into deep shadow. "It's been quite a month," Madeline remarked, breaking the comfortable silence. "I barely recognize myself from the woman who arrived in Silverton." Yates glanced at her, a hint of a smile playing at his lips. "How so?" "When I came west, I was running away as much as running toward something new. I was afraid, though I wouldn't have admitted it then." She looked down at her hands, the newly formed calluses visible even in the dim light. "Now I feel stronger, more certain." "This country has a way of stripping away pretenses," Yates agreed. "Shows you who you really are or who you can be." Madeline looked up at him, studying his profile in the half-light. Over the past weeks, she'd come to respect his quiet competence and unfailing fairness. He'd never once treated her as less capable because she was a woman, only acknowledged the practical realities of her inexperience. "What about you, Mr. Prescott? Who were you before Colorado?" He was quiet for so long that Madeline thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and measured. "I was a different man. Younger, more foolish. The war changed me like it changed most who fought in it." He ran a hand through his damp hair. "After I couldn't stay in Tennessee, too many memories, too many ghosts." "You lost someone?" Madeline asked gently. "My brother, my parents, our home." His jaw tightened. I came west with nothing but a horse and the clothes on my back. Worked cattle drives, broke horses, did whatever it took to survive. Then I met your uncle. He was a good judge of character, saw something in me worth salvaging, I guess. He helped you get your ranch, Yates nodded. Loaned me enough to make a down payment on a small piece of land. Said I could work it off helping him during busy seasons. By the time I paid him back, we'd become friends. Madeline smiled softly. He sounds like he was a wonderful man. I wish I'd known him better. He visited us in Boston only a few times when I was young. He spoke of you, Yates said, surprising her. Said his niece was a Turner through and through, stubborn and smart as a whip. Showed me a daguerreotype once, must have been from years back. You were just a girl then. He kept a picture of me. Madeline felt a lump form in her throat. On his mantle. Said you reminded him of his sister, your mother. Outside, the rain began to slacken, the thunder now a distant rumble. Madeline stood, reluctantly removing Yates's coat and handing it back to him. I think we can make it to the cabin now, she said, smoothing her damp skirt. Yates rose as well, taking the coat but not putting it on. Instead, he draped it over Madeline's shoulders again. Keep it until we get inside. I don't mind the rain. They ran across the muddy yard to the cabin, splashing through puddles like children. By the time they reached the porch, they were both laughing despite being soaked again. Inside, Madeline stoked the banked fire in the stove while Yates lit the lamps. The warm glow filled the cabin, creating a cozy haven against the storm outside. You should change into something dry, Yates suggested, keeping a respectful distance. I've got a spare shirt in my saddlebag. I'll fetch it while you change. After they had both changed into dry clothes, Madeline into a simple house dress and Yates into his spare shirt, they sat at the kitchen table with mugs of hot coffee. The domesticity of the scene struck Madeline suddenly, the two of them sharing the warmth and shelter of her home as the storm continued outside. I should head back to town once the rain lets up completely, Yates said, though he made no move to leave. It's getting late, Madeline observed. The road will be muddy and treacherous in the dark. You could. She hesitated, aware of the impropriety of what she was about to suggest. You could stay in the spare room, as a practical matter. Yates looked surprised, then concerned. I wouldn't want to compromise your reputation, Miss Turner. Folks in small towns talk. I'm already the subject of gossip as the eccentric Easterner trying to run a ranch, she replied with a wry smile. Besides, Mrs. Coleman knows you've been helping me, and she strikes me as a woman whose good opinion matters in Silverton. Yates considered this. You're not wrong about Mrs. Coleman, still. It's the sensible solution, Madeline insisted. The spare room is clean, there's plenty of food, and it saves you a dangerous ride in the dark. After a moment's consideration, he nodded. All right, but I'll be gone at first light before anyone from town might come calling. They spent the evening in comfortable conversation, with Madeline asking questions about the upcoming cattle round-up and winter preparations. As the hour grew late, she showed him to the spare room, a simple space with a narrow bed, chest of drawers, and a small table. It's not luxurious, she apologized, but it's clean. It's more than adequate, Yates assured her. Thank you for your hospitality, Miss Turner. After all these weeks, I think you might call me Madeline, she suggested, surprising herself with her boldness. He smiled, the warmth reaching his eyes. Then you must call me Yates. Good night, Yates, she said softly, lingering in the doorway a moment longer than necessary. Good night, Madeline, he replied, his voice equally soft. In her own room, Madeline found sleep elusive despite her physical exhaustion. The awareness of Yates's presence just down the hall filled her with a strange mixture of comfort and nervous energy. It had been years since she'd felt such a connection to another person, if indeed she ever had. In Boston, the men who had courted her had been interested primarily in her father's business connections or her modest dowry. None had ever looked at her the way Yates sometimes did, as if truly seeing her, valuing her determination and growing capabilities rather than just her appearance or family connections. She drifted to sleep eventually, lulled by the sound of rain on the roof and the knowledge that she wasn't alone. True to his word, Yates was gone when Madeline awoke the next morning. The only evidence of his presence was a neatly folded blanket on the spare bed and a note on the kitchen table, "Gone to town for supplies. Will be back by noon." Why Madeline smiled at his consideration, then set about her morning chores with renewed energy. The next few weeks brought increasing activity as preparations for the fall roundup intensified. Yates had hired 2 experienced cowhands brothers named Jim and Thomas Riley, who proved to be hardworking and respectful. They showed no outward signs of resentment at working for a woman, though Madeline suspected that Yates had carefully selected men who wouldn't balk at the unusual arrangement. The roundup itself was a revelation to Madeline. Despite all her reading and preparation, nothing had quite prepared her for the organized chaos of gathering scattered cattle, branding the calves born that spring, and separating those destined for market. She insisted on participating alongside the men, though Yates initially tried to assign her lighter duties. After catching her practicing with a lasso in the early morning hours, he relented and began teaching her the basics of roping. "Your form's not bad," he admitted after watching her successfully rope a post for the 10th time in a row. "But a live calf moves a lot faster than that post." "Then perhaps I need a more challenging target," Madeline replied, her eyes twinkling with mischief. "Would you care to volunteer, Mr. Prescott?" Yates laughed, a full, rich sound that Madeline had come to treasure for its rarity. "I value my neck too much, Miss Turner, but there's a young steer in the corral that might serve as practice." By the end of the day, Madeline had successfully roped her first calf, an accomplishment that filled her with disproportionate pride. When Jim Riley offered a gruff, "Not bad, Miss Turner," she felt as if she'd received the highest praise. That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains in fiery hues, Madeline felt a deep contentment settle over her. "A penny for your thoughts," Yates said, his chair tilted back against the cabin wall. "I was just thinking that I've never been happier," Madeline admitted. "Even with all the hard work and uncertainty, this feels right." Yates studied her profile in the fading light. "You've taken to ranching like you were born to it. Your uncle would be proud." "I hope so." She turned to look at him directly. "I couldn't have done any of this without your help, Yates. I want you to know how grateful I am." "You'd have managed," he replied. "Maybe not as quickly, but you'd have found your way. You're not one to give up easily." "Is that a polite way of calling me stubborn?" she asked with a smile. "Determined," he corrected, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "It's a quality I admire." The warmth in his gaze made Madeline's heart beat faster. Over these weeks of working side by side, something had shifted between them, a growing awareness that went beyond friendship or professional respect. Before she could respond, the sound of approaching hoofbeats drew their attention. A rider was coming down the road at a brisk pace despite the gathering dusk. Yates stood, his hand moving instinctively to the gun at his hip. "Were you expecting anyone?" Madeline shook her head, rising to stand beside him as the rider came into view. It was Thomas Riley, one of their hands, riding hard. "Miss Turner, Mr. Prescott," he called as he approached, reining his horse to a stop in front of the porch. "Trouble at the north pasture. Rustlers hit while we were working the south range. Took maybe 20 head." Yates's expression hardened. "Recently, tracks are fresh. Jim's following them now, but he sent me to fetch you." "Damn," Yates muttered. He turned to Madeline. "Stay here, lock the doors, I'll go with Thomas." "I most certainly will not stay behind," Madeline replied firmly. "This is my ranch and my cattle. Madeline, these men are dangerous. All the more reason I should know how to deal with them. I can't hide in the cabin every time there's trouble." She met his gaze steadily. "I can shoot straight and I can ride. I'm coming." Yates looked like he wanted to argue, but the determined set of her jaw made him reconsider. "Fine. But you stay behind me, and if there's any shooting, you find cover immediately." "Understood." "Understood," Madeline agreed, already moving toward the barn to saddle Daisy. Within minutes, the three of them were galloping toward the north pasture, the last light of day fading rapidly. They found Jim Riley at the edge of a wooded area, examining tracks by lantern light. "4 men heading east along the creek," he reported. "They've got about an hour's head start." "They'll be pushing the cattle toward Carson's Gulch," Yates surmised. "It's the easiest route out of the valley without being seen from town." "Do we follow them now, or wait for morning?" Madeline asked. The men exchanged glances. "If we wait, they'll be long gone with your cattle," Yates explained. "But tracking at night is dangerous, especially in rough country." Madeline straightened in her saddle. "Those cattle represent a significant portion of my livelihood. We follow them now." Yates nodded, a hint of approval in his eyes. "Jim, Thomas, get your rifles. We'll follow the creek bed as far as we can, then cut across to Carson's Gulch to try to head them off." The night ride was unlike anything Madeline had experienced. They moved as quickly as the darkness allowed, with Jim leading the way, occasionally dismounting to check tracks by lantern light. The moon was nearly full, providing just enough illumination to avoid the worst obstacles, but Madeline's heart pounded with each uncertain step of her horse. After nearly 2 hours of tense riding, they heard the distant lowing of cattle echoing through the night. "That's them," Yates whispered, signaling for the group to halt. "They'll be moving slow with that many head. We can circle around and get ahead of them at the narrow part of the gulch." He turned to Madeline. "This is where it gets dangerous. You should wait here while we go ahead." "No," she replied firmly. "I need to see this through." After a moment's hesitation, he nodded. "Stay close to me, and remember, if shooting starts, find cover immediately." They rode in a wide arc, avoiding the main trail and picking their way carefully across a rocky hillside. Finally, they reached a position overlooking a narrow passage between 2 steep embankments. "The rustlers will have to bring the cattle through here," Yates explained in a hushed voice. "It's the only way to the old mining road beyond." They dismounted, securing their horses behind a stand of pine trees, then took up positions among the rocks above the passage. The wait seemed interminable, but eventually they heard the approaching sounds of cattle and men. In the moonlight, Madeline could make out 4 riders guiding her stolen cattle through the narrow passage below. Even at a distance, she felt a surge of anger at this violation of her property, her home. Yates raised his rifle, calling out in a commanding voice, "That's far enough. You're driving stolen cattle. Throw down your weapons and surrender." For a split second, everything seemed frozen. Then chaos erupted as the rustlers drew their guns, firing wildly toward the rocks where Yates's voice had come from. "Get down!" Yates shouted, pulling Madeline behind a large boulder as bullets ricocheted off the rocks around them. The Riley brothers returned fire from their positions, forcing the rustlers to seek cover. The cattle, panicked by the gunfire, began to scatter, some breaking back the way they had come. "Stay here," Yates ordered, moving to a better firing position. Madeline's heart pounded in her ears as the gunfight continued. From her sheltered position, she could see one of the rustlers trying to circle around behind the Riley brothers. Without thinking, she raised her rifle, took careful aim as Yates had taught her, and squeezed the trigger. The man cried out, dropping his gun and clutching his arm. The sudden reversal seemed to break the rustler's resolve. "We give up," came a shout from below. "Don't shoot." "Throw your guns out where we can see them," Yates called back. One by one, the rustlers tossed their weapons onto the open ground. Yates signaled for Jim and Thomas to cover him as he moved down to secure the prisoners. Madeline emerged from behind the boulder, rifle still ready, and made her way carefully down to join them. The four rustlers stood with their hands raised, 3 men and a boy who couldn't have been more than 16. "You're on Turner land," Madeline said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Those are my cattle you were stealing." The oldest of the rustlers, a weathered man with a scraggly beard, spat on the ground. "Didn't know cattle could belong to a woman." "Well, now you do," she replied coldly, "and you'll face the consequences just the same." As dawn broke, they herded the recovered cattle back toward the ranch, with the rustlers riding under the watchful eyes of the Riley brothers. The injured man's wound had been bandied with a torn shirt, painful but not life-threatening. "The sheriff will want to question them," Yates explained as they rode. "Cattle rustling is a serious offense." Madeline nodded, exhaustion beginning to set in now that the danger had passed. "What about the boy? He seems too young for prison." Yates glanced at the youth riding sullenly between the Riley brothers. "That'll be up to the judge, but first offenders sometimes get leniency, especially the young ones." By the time they reached the ranch, Madeline was swaying in her saddle with fatigue. As they dismounted in the yard, Yates moved to her side, steadying her with a gentle hand on her elbow. "You should rest," he said quietly. "We can handle things from here." "I'm fine," she insisted, though her legs felt like rubber beneath her. "I want to see this through." Yates studied her face, concern evident in his eyes. "You've already proven yourself 10 times over, Madeline. No one would question your courage or commitment after tonight." His words penetrated her exhaustion, warming her from within. She realized he was right. She had nothing left to prove, at least not today. "All right," she conceded, "but wake me when the sheriff arrives." Madeline barely remembered walking to her bedroom. She managed to remove her boots before collapsing onto the bed, still fully clothed, and falling into a deep, dreamless sleep. When she awoke, golden afternoon light was streaming through her window. She sat up with a start, realizing she'd slept most of the day away. After quickly washing her face and changing into a clean dress, she emerged to find Yates and Sheriff Davis talking at her kitchen table. "Ah, there she is," the sheriff said, rising politely. "Mr. Prescott was just filling me in on your adventure last night." "That was some quick thinking, Miss Turner." "Thank you, Sheriff," Madeline replied, accepting the cup of coffee Yates offered her. "What will happen to the rustlers?" "They're locked up in town, awaiting the circuit judge next week. The older ones will likely see prison time." The sheriff hesitated. "As for the boy, Lucas, he claims he was forced to join them. First offense, too. The judge might be lenient if someone were willing to vouch for him, maybe offer him honest work." Madeline caught the subtle suggestion in his words. "You think I should give him a job?" "After he tried to steal my cattle?" "Not saying that exactly," the sheriff replied carefully. "Just that boys like that, they often go bad for lack of better options. Sometimes all they need is a chance." After the sheriff departed, promising to send word when the judge arrived, Madeline sat quietly at the table, turning her coffee cup in her hands. "You're considering it, aren't you?" Yates asked, watching her thoughtful expression. "Is it foolish to trust someone who's already betrayed that trust once?" Yates leaned back in his chair, considering. "People can surprise you, sometimes for the worse, but sometimes for the better too." He paused. like a certain Easterner who turned out to be a better rancher than anyone expected. Madeline smiled at that. I had help. You had guidance, he corrected. The rest was all you. Their eyes met across the table, and something in his gaze made Madeline's breath catch. The connection between them had deepened through shared danger, growing into something neither had anticipated. Yates, she began hesitantly. A knock at the door interrupted whatever she had been about to say. It was Jim Riley, come to report that all the stolen cattle had been recovered and returned to pasture. The moment passed, but Madeline found herself thinking about it later that evening as she sat on the porch watching the sunset. The events of the past 24 hours had clarified something for her. Life in this wild country was unpredictable and sometimes dangerous, but it also offered a freedom and purpose she'd never known in Boston. And then there was Yates. Steady, dependable, surprisingly gentle Yates, who had become so much more than just a helpful neighbor. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of his footsteps on the porch steps. He carried 2 cups of coffee, offering one to her before taking a seat in the chair beside her. "Penny for your thoughts?" he asked, echoing his question from the previous evening. Madeline smiled, accepting the coffee. "I was thinking about what the sheriff said about the boy, Lucas. And I think I'll offer him a job once the judge rules. On probation, of course." Yates nodded. "It's a generous decision." "Perhaps," she agreed, "or perhaps just a practical one. We could use another hand, especially with winter coming." They sat in comfortable silence as the sky deepened from gold to crimson to purple. Madeline found herself acutely aware of Yates's presence beside her, the sound of his breathing, the faint scent of leather and pine that seemed to cling to him. "I should thank you," she said eventually, "for everything you did last night, and for all you've taught me these past weeks." Yates turned to look at her, his expression softening in the fading light. "You don't need to thank me, Madeline. I've enjoyed our time together." "As have I," she admitted, "more than I expected to." A beat of silence passed between them, charged with unspoken feelings. "When I came to Silverton," Madeline continued, her voice quieter now, "I wasn't looking for connections. I thought I needed to be entirely self-sufficient." "And now?" Yates asked, his voice equally soft. "Now I understand that independence doesn't have to mean isolation." She met his gaze directly. "I've come to value your presence in my life, Yates, very much." He set his coffee cup aside, turning more fully toward her. "Madeline," whatever he had been about to say was cut short by the distant sound of approaching riders. Both of them stood, instinctively alert after the events of the previous night. 2 figures on horseback emerged from the gathering dusk, coming up the road toward the ranch. As they drew closer, Madeline gasped in recognition. "Edward! Margaret!" she called out in disbelief. The riders approached, and there was no mistake, it was indeed her stepbrother Edward and his wife Margaret, looking travel-worn but unmistakable in their Eastern clothing. "Madeline, thank goodness," Edward called as they dismounted. "We've been searching for this place for hours." Yates stepped forward, helping Margaret down from her horse while Madeline stood frozen in shock. "What are you doing here?" Madeline finally managed, making no move to embrace either of them. Edward removed his hat, revealing hair that was immaculately styled despite the journey. "Father sent us. We've been worried about you, off in this wilderness alone." "Worried," Madeline repeated, disbelief evident in her tone. "You made it quite clear when I left Boston that my welfare was no longer a family concern." Margaret stepped forward, her expression conciliatory. "That was a misunderstanding, dear Madeline. Of course we've been concerned, when we received no word from you for months." "I wrote to Father twice," Madeline countered. "Once upon arriving in Silverton and again after settling at the ranch." Edward and Margaret exchanged glances. "We received no letters," Edward claimed. "But that's beside the point. We've come to take you home." Madeline felt as if the ground had shifted beneath her feet. "This is my home now." "Don't be absurd," Edward scoffed. "A woman cannot manage a ranch alone. Father has arranged everything. The property can be sold, and you'll return to Boston where you belong." Yates, who had been silently observing the exchange, stepped forward. "Miss Turner isn't alone," he said, his voice level but firm. "And she's managing this ranch quite capably." Edward assessed Yates with obvious disdain, taking in his worn clothing and weathered appearance. "And you are," Yates Prescott, "neighbor and friend to Miss Turner." "Well, Mr. Prescott, this is a family matter. I'm sure you understand." Madeline found her voice again, anger lending its strength. "Yates stays. This is my property, my home, and he is welcome here." She turned to Edward. "You and Margaret, however, are welcome only as guests, not as representatives of my father come to dictate my future." Edward's face reddened. "Madeline, be reasonable. This is no life for a woman of your upbringing. Look at you. Your hands are calloused, your face is tanned, and you're dressed like like a woman who works for a living," Madeline supplied, her chin lifting. "Yes, I am, and I'm proud of what I've accomplished here." "Father will cut you off completely if you persist in this foolishness," Edward threatened. "Father already did that, when he allowed you and your mother to push me out of the family business," Madeline replied coldly. "I have neither expected nor received anything from him since." An uncomfortable silence fell over the group. Finally, Margaret spoke, her tone softly persuasive. "At least invite us in, Madeline. We've had a long journey and there are matters we should discuss privately." Madeline hesitated, then nodded stiffly. "You may stay the night." "We can talk in the morning. I'll show you to the spare room." As Edward and Margaret collected their bags from their horses, Yates moved closer to Madeline. "Do you want me to stay?" he asked quietly. She looked up at him gratefully. "Yes, but it's not necessary. I can handle my stepbrother." "I don't doubt that for a second," he replied with a small smile. "But I'll be back in the morning, just the same." After showing Edward and Margaret to the spare room, Madeline prepared a simple dinner in strained silence. The conversation over the meal was painfully formal, with Edward and Margaret making thinly veiled remarks about the primitive conditions and isolation of ranch life. Pleading exhaustion, Madeline retired to her room early, though sleep eluded her. Her mind raced with questions about her stepbrother's sudden appearance and what it might mean for her future. The next morning, Madeline rose with the dawn as usual, determined to maintain her normal routine despite her unwelcome guests. She had just started the coffee when Edward appeared, looking uncomfortable in his rumpled city clothes. "You're up early," he observed. "Ranch work doesn't wait," she replied simply, pouring him a cup of coffee. "Edward, let's be honest with each other. Why are you really here?" He sipped the coffee, grimacing slightly at its strength. "Father is ill, Madeline. His heart is weak. The doctors say." He hesitated. "They say he may not have much time left." Madeline felt a pang of genuine concern. Despite their differences, Samuel Turner had been her father's brother, and family ties ran deep. "I'm sorry to hear that," she said sincerely. "But that doesn't explain why you've come to bring me back to Boston. My presence never seemed to improve Father's health before." Edward had the grace to look somewhat ashamed. "Things have changed. Father regrets the rift between you. He wants to make amends before it's too late." Madeline studied her stepbrother's face, trying to discern the truth in his words. "And what of your mother? Has she had a similar change of heart?" "Mother is resigned to Father's wishes," Edward admitted. "Look, Madeline, I know we've had our differences, but Father truly wants to see you again. Is that so difficult to believe?" Before Madeline could respond, there was a knock at the door. She opened it to find Yates standing on the porch, hat in hand. "Morning," he greeted, nodding to Edward as he entered. "Hope I'm not interrupting." "Not at all," Madeline replied, grateful for his presence. "Edward was just explaining why he believes I should return to Boston." Yates raised an eyebrow but said nothing, accepting the cup of coffee Madeline offered him. Edward cleared his throat uncomfortably. "As I was saying, Father is ill and wishes to reconcile, but there are practical considerations as well. With his health failing, the business needs attention. Your experience could be valuable." "The business that I was forced out of?" Madeline asked pointedly. "Things have changed," Edward insisted. "Mother has stepped back from day-to-day operations, and frankly, we've had some setbacks that might have been avoided with your financial acumen." Madeline couldn't help a small, bitter laugh. "So now my financial acumen is valuable again. How convenient." Margaret joined them, her face carefully composed despite the early hour. "Madeline, dear, we're not asking you to abandon everything you've built here. The ranch could be managed by hired hands while you return to help stabilize the family business. You could even come back periodically to check on things." Yates, who had been silently observing, finally spoke. "Sounds to me like you're asking Miss Turner to split herself between two worlds, neither of which would get her full attention." He looked at Madeline. "That's a difficult way to live." "With all due respect, Mr. Prescott," Edward said stiffly, "this is a family matter." "And with all due respect, Mr. Turner," Madeline countered, "Yates's opinion matters to me. He understands what this ranch means to me in a way you never could." An awkward silence fell over the kitchen. Finally, Madeline sighed. "I need to think about this. In the meantime, I have work to do." "The cattle won't feed themselves." "Allow me to help," Edward offered in what seemed a genuine attempt at reconciliation. "I'd like to understand what your life is like here." Madeline looked skeptical but nodded. "Very well. You can help with the morning feeding. You'll need to change into something more practical." While Edward went to change, Margaret drew Madeline aside. "Your father truly is ill, Madeline. Whatever else you might think of us, please believe that." "I do believe it," Madeline replied softly, "and I'm sorry for his suffering. But that doesn't change the fact that you and your mother made my position in that house untenable." "People can change," Margaret insisted. "Even my mother-in-law, she's mellowed with your father's illness." Madeline remained unconvinced, but said nothing more as Edward returned wearing the most casual clothing he had brought, still far too fine for ranch work. The morning was a study in contrasts. Edward tried gamely to help with chores but was clearly out of his element. His polished boots became caked with mud, his hands developed blisters from just an hour of work, and his complaints about the dust, the animals, and the physical labor grew more frequent as the morning progressed. By midday, he had retreated to the porch, watching as Madeline and Yates continued working with practiced efficiency. The differences between the siblings, one city-bred and the other adapted to frontier life, had never been more apparent. Over lunch, Edward made one final appeal. "Madeline, I understand that you've built something here, but is it really worth sacrificing your relationship with Father? He may not have much time left." Madeline was quiet for a long moment. "I need time to think," she finally said, "and I'd like to finish today's work in peace." Edward nodded, recognizing that pushing further would only strengthen her resistance. "We'll leave tomorrow morning. Will you have an answer for us by then?" "Yes," Madeline promised, "one way or another." That evening, after Edward and Margaret had retired to the spare room, Madeline sat on the porch steps, watching as stars appeared one by one in the deepening blue of the sky. Yates joined her silently, offering a cup of coffee before settling beside her. "Penny for your thoughts." he asked, the familiar question bringing a small smile to her lips despite her troubled mind. "They're worth considerably more tonight," she replied. "I'm trying to decide the course of my future." "And what are the options as you see them?" Madeline sighed. "I could return to Boston, at least temporarily, help with the family business, reconcile with my father before it's too late." She turned to look at him. "Or I could stay here, continue building something that's truly mine with people I've come to." She hesitated. "Care about." Yates was quiet for a long moment. "What does your heart tell you?" "That's the problem," Madeline admitted. "Part of me wants to see my father again, to resolve our differences before it's too late. But another part fears that returning to Boston would mean surrendering everything I've fought for here." "It doesn't have to be all or nothing," Yates suggested. "You could visit Boston, spend time with your father, then return." "Would there be anything to return to?" she asked softly. "Ranches don't run themselves, and people move on." The unspoken question hung between them: would he still be here if she left, even temporarily? Yates turned to face her more directly. "Madeline, there's something I need to say, something I should have said before now." Her heart quickened at the serious note in his voice. "What is it?" "When I first met you, I thought you were just another Easterner playing at frontier life that you'd give up and go home when things got difficult." He smiled slightly. "I've never been happier to be proven wrong." "Is that what you wanted to tell me?" Madeline asked, aware that her voice had softened. "No." He took a deep breath. "What I want to say is that these past months working alongside you have been the best of my life. You're unlike any woman I've ever met, strong, determined, willing to fight for what you believe in. And I—" He hesitated, then continued with quiet certainty. "I've fallen in love with you." The words hung in the night air between them. Madeline felt as if her heart might burst from her chest. "Yates," she whispered. You don't need to say anything now," he interrupted gently. "You have decisions to make, and I don't want to complicate things further, but I needed you to know how I feel before you decide." Madeline reached out, taking his hand in hers. "You're not complicating things," she said softly. "You're clarifying them." She moved closer until she could feel the warmth of him beside her. "I've fallen in love with you too, Yates Prescott. Somewhere between teaching me to mend fences and chasing cattle rustlers, you became essential to me." His eyes searched hers in the dim light from the cabin windows. "Are you certain your life here is so different from what you knew before?" "That's precisely it," she replied. "This life, this hard, beautiful, unpredictable life feels more authentic than anything I experienced in Boston. And you've been at the heart of that discovery." Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, Yates leaned forward and kissed her. His lips were gentle against hers, one hand coming up to cradle her face with a tenderness that made her heart ache. When they finally parted, Madeline felt as if something fundamental had shifted within her world. The decision that had seemed so difficult hours before now felt remarkably clear. "I need to see my father," she said, still holding Yates's hand. "To make peace if I can. But this is my home now, Yates. My life is here. With you if you'll have me." "If I'll have you," he repeated with a soft laugh. "Madeline Turner, I'd be the luckiest man in Colorado territory to build a life with you." They sat together under the stars, planning for a future neither had anticipated when they'd first met. Madeline would travel to Boston, spend time with her ailing father, and then return to Silverton, to her ranch and to Yates. The next morning, Madeline informed Edward and Margaret of her decision. "I'll come to Boston," she told them, "but only for a short visit. My home is here now, and I'll be returning." Edward looked like he might argue, but something in Madeline's resolute expression stopped him. "Father will be pleased to see you, however brief the visit," he said instead. As Edward and Margaret prepared to depart, Madeline added, I'll follow in 2 weeks. There are arrangements I need to make here first to ensure the ranch runs smoothly in my absence." With promises to meet in Boston, the visitors departed, leaving Madeline and Yates standing in the yard. 2 weeks isn't much time to prepare for winter and your absence, Yates observed. Madeline smiled up at him. "That's why I'll need your help, Mr. Prescott. And perhaps something more permanent than our current arrangement." "What did you have in mind, Miss Turner?" he asked, his eyes crinkling with amusement. "A partnership," she replied, "of the most personal nature." Yates took her hand, raising it to his lips. "Are you proposing to me, Madeline Turner?" "I believe I am," she answered, her cheeks flushing slightly. "Though it's rather unconventional." "You're rather unconventional," he pointed out, drawing her closer. "That's why I noticed you in the first place." "I'm not like other women," she warned, echoing words she had spoken to others before, words that had always felt like an apology until now. "That's why I noticed you," the cowboy replied, his voice tender as he bent to kiss her again. "And that's why I love you." The following 2 weeks passed in a whirlwind of activity. Madeline and Yates worked from dawn until dusk to ensure the ranch would be well prepared for winter and her absence. The Riley brothers agreed to stay on, with increased responsibilities. Young Lucas, released into Madeline's custody by the circuit judge, proved eager to prove himself worthy of the second chance he'd been given. Word spread quickly through Silverton about Madeline and Yates's engagement. Mrs. Coleman took it upon herself to organize an impromptu celebration at the boarding house, where the couple was toasted by many of the townsfolk who had come to respect the unusual Easterner and the quiet rancher who had won her heart. Sheriff Davis offered his congratulations with a knowing smile. "Knew from the first time I saw you two together that something was brewing," he claimed, raising a glass in their direction. The night before Madeline was to depart for Boston, she and Yates sat on the porch of what was now truly their home, his arm around her shoulders as they watched the sunset paint the mountains. "Are you nervous?" he asked. "About Boston, I mean." Madeline considered the question. "A little," she admitted, "but not about the city itself, more about facing my father after all this time. He'll be proud of what you've accomplished," Yates said with conviction. "Any father would be." "I hope so," she replied softly, "but even if he isn't, I know I've made the right choices." She turned to look at him. "Promise me you'll write?" "Every day," he assured her, "though my penmanship might make you question your choice of husband." Madeline laughed, leaning into his embrace. "I've never been more certain of any choice in my life." "When you return," Yates said, his voice growing serious, "I thought we might be married right away. Unless you want a grand Boston wedding." "Goodness, no," Madeline replied quickly. "A simple ceremony here in Silverton would be perfect, with our friends and neighbors. And then—" she smiled, envisioning their future together. "And then we continue building our life here, expanding the ranch, perhaps, making it something that will outlast us both." "Children?" Yates asked softly. "Eventually," Madeline agreed, her cheeks warming. "Little cowboys and cowgirls running around underfoot. They'll have the best of both worlds," Yates mused. "Your intelligence and determination, maybe some of those fancy Boston manners. And your strength, your kindness," Madeline added, "your way with horses and cattle." They sat in comfortable silence as the last light faded from the sky, each lost in thoughts of the future they would build together. The journey to Boston was long and arduous, but Madeline found herself viewing the changing landscape with new eyes. The cities and towns that had once been her entire world now seemed cramped and artificial compared to the wide, open spaces of Colorado. When she finally arrived at her father's townhouse, Madeline was struck by how small it appeared compared to her memories. The butler who answered the door barely concealed his shock at her appearance, her simple, practical dress and sun-kissed complexion, a stark contrast to the pale, fashionably attired young woman who had left months before. Her father, propped up on pillows in his bedroom, looked frail and diminished, but his eyes lit up at the sight of her. "Madeline," he whispered, extending a thin hand. "You came." "Of course I came," she replied, moving to sit beside him. "You're my father." In the days that followed, they began the slow process of reconciliation. Her father listened with genuine interest as she described the ranch, the challenges she'd overcome, and the community she'd found in Silverton. "And this man, this Prescott fellow," her father asked one afternoon, "he treats you well?" "Very well," Madeline assured him. "He respects me, father, as a partner, not just as a woman to be protected or instructed." Her father nodded slowly. "Your mother would have liked him, I think. She always said you had her spirit too strong to be contained by drawing rooms and social calls." "You never told me that before," Madeline said softly. "I should have," he acknowledged. "There's much I should have said and done differently, especially after I remarried." To Madeline's surprise, even her stepmother made efforts toward reconciliation, though their relationship remained formal and somewhat strained. Edward, perhaps recognizing that his own position in the family business was more secure with Madeline settled elsewhere, became almost cordial. As the weeks passed, Madeline's father showed small signs of improvement. The doctor cautiously suggested that her presence seemed to have a beneficial effect on his spirits, if not his underlying condition. "Stay through Christmas," her father urged as November drew to a close. "It would mean so much to have you here." Madeline hesitated, torn between her promise to return to Yates and her desire to spend this time which might be their last with her father. "Let me write to Yates," she finally decided. "If he can manage without me a bit longer, I'll stay." Yates's reply came a week later, delivered along with several previous letters that had been delayed by winter weather in the mountains. "My dearest Madeline," he wrote, "stay as long as your father needs you. The ranch is in good hands with the Riley brothers, and Lucas is proving himself more capable by the day. As for me, I miss you with every sunrise, but knowing you're where you need to be brings its own comfort. Your home and your heart await your return, whenever that may be." With that blessing, Madeline extended her stay, finding unexpected joy in rebuilding her relationship with her father. They spent hours discussing the shipping business, with Madeline offering insights that helped address some of the company's recent challenges. "You've not lost your touch for business," her father observed proudly. "Colorado hasn't completely turned you into a cowgirl," Madeline smiled. "I've become both more and less than I was, I think. The ranch has taught me practical skills I never imagined I'd need, but also patience and a different kind of problem-solving." As Christmas approached, Boston transformed into a whirl of social engagements and holiday preparations. Madeline found herself pulled back into her old world of formal dinners and carefully orchestrated social calls. While she participated with good grace, these events only reinforced her certainty that her true home was now in Silverton. "You're different," observed her old friend Charlotte at a Christmas Eve soiree. "More centered somehow, and your complexion, all that fresh air has given you such a healthy glow." Madeline laughed. "That's a polite way of saying I'm tanned as a farmhand." "Not at all," Charlotte insisted. "You look vibrant, alive in a way many of us here never quite manage." She leaned closer, lowering her voice. "And this rancher of yours, is he terribly handsome and rugged?" "He is to me," Madeline replied with a smile, "though he'd laugh at being described that way. Yates is solid, trustworthy, kind in ways that matter." "You love him very much," Charlotte observed, not a question but a statement. "I do," Madeline agreed simply. More than I ever thought possible. Christmas Day brought a telegram from Yates, wishing her and her family a joyous holiday. The simple message brought tears to Madeline's eyes and prompted curious questions from her family about the man who had captured her heart. As January arrived with blustering snow and bitter cold, Madeline began making preparations to return to Colorado. Her father's health, while still fragile, had stabilized enough that her immediate presence was no longer necessary. "I've been thinking," her father said one evening as they sat by the fire in his study. "Your uncle's property, your ranch now, it needs investment to grow properly." Madeline looked up from the book she'd been reading. "That's true, but we're managing. Yates and I have plans for expanding gradually." Her father nodded thoughtfully. "I'd like to help if you'll allow it, not as a controlling interest but as a silent partner, an investment in your future." "Father, that's not necessary," Madeline began. "Perhaps not necessary, but something I want to do," he interrupted gently. "Consider it a belated wedding gift and perhaps some small atonement for how things ended when you left Boston." Madeline studied her father's face, seeing genuine regret and hope there. "We would maintain complete control of operations," she clarified. "Absolutely," he assured her. "I have no desire to interfere in a business I know nothing about. This would be capital only, to use as you and your husband see fit." After careful consideration, Madeline accepted his offer, recognizing that such investment could help them weather potential hard times and build something more substantial than they might manage alone. As the day of her departure approached, Madeline found herself both eager to return to Yates and the ranch, yet reluctant to leave her father, knowing it might be their final farewell. "You'll write?" her father asked as they said their goodbyes. "Every week," Madeline promised. "And perhaps, when you're stronger, you might visit us. See what we're building in Colorado." "I'd like that," he replied, though both knew it was unlikely his health would permit such a journey. "Be happy, my daughter. That's all I've ever truly wanted for you." The journey west felt both longer and shorter than her eastward trip had been. Longer because of her eagerness to return to Yates, shorter because each mile brought her closer to home, her true home now. As the train approached the station nearest Silverton, Madeline pressed her face to the window, drinking in the sight of the snow-covered mountains in the distance. A familiar figure waited on the platform, tall and straight in a heavy coat, his hat pulled low against the winter wind. Yates. The moment the train stopped, Madeline was moving, hardly waiting for the porter to help her down the steps before rushing into Yates's waiting arms. "Welcome home," he murmured into her hair, holding her tight as if he might never let go. "I've missed you so much," she replied, drawing back just enough to look into his face, the face that had haunted her dreams for 3 long months. The drive to Silverton in Yates's wagon was filled with catching up on all the news too detailed for letters. The Riley brothers had managed the cattle well through the early winter storms. Lucas had proven himself trustworthy and hardworking. The town had a new doctor, a young man from Chicago who had decided to try his luck in the West. "And you?" Madeline asked, studying Yates's profile as he drove. "How have you been, truly?" He glanced at her, a smile warming his eyes. "Counting the days until you returned. Though I kept busy enough, made some improvements to the cabin, a surprise for you." As they approached the ranch, Madeline felt her heart swell with emotion. The cabin looked just as she remembered, smoke curling invitingly from the chimney against the winter sky. Jim and Thomas Riley emerged from the barn as the wagon approached, waving welcome. Even young Lucas appeared, looking more filled out and confident than when she'd left. "They wanted to be here to welcome you home," Yates explained. "Mrs. Coleman too, but she's laid up with a winter cold." Inside, Madeline discovered the improvements. Yates had mentioned new shelves lined with books, curtains on the windows, a rocking chair by the fireplace. But the most touching addition was a framed photograph of her parents that she'd left in Boston years ago. "Edward sent it," Yates explained, watching her face as she traced the frame with gentle fingers. "Thought you might want it here." "It's perfect," she whispered. "All of it, thank you." That evening, after a celebratory dinner with their ranch hands, Madeline and Yates sat alone by the fire, her head resting on his shoulder as they spoke of their plans for the future. "Father's investment will allow us to expand sooner than we'd planned," Madeline explained. "We could increase the herd, perhaps build a larger barn by summer. And there's something else we should consider," Yates added, a hint of nervousness in his voice. "What's that?" "Building on a proper bedroom." He turned to look at her directly. "For the children we hope to have." Madeline smiled, warmth spreading through her at the thought. "I'd like that very much, though perhaps we should focus on becoming husband and wife first, as soon as possible," Yates agreed fervently. "I spoke with Reverend Phillips while you were away. He can marry us whenever we're ready." 2 weeks later, on a crisp February morning, Madeline Turner became Madeline Prescott in a simple ceremony at Silverton's small church. She wore a new dress of pale blue wool, with a single string of pearls that had been her mother's. Yates wore his best suit, freshly pressed, his usually untamed hair neatly combed beneath his good hat. The entire town turned out for the occasion, filling the church to capacity. Mrs. Coleman had rallied from her cold to organize a reception at the hotel, where the newlyweds were toasted with genuine affection by neighbors who had come to respect them both. "To the finest ranchers in the county," Sheriff Davis proclaimed, raising his glass. "And proof that sometimes the best partnerships start with taking a chance on someone different." As spring melted the snow and brought new life to the land, the Turner Prescott Ranch, as it came to be known locally, flourished under the care of its owners. With her father's investment, they were able to purchase additional breeding stock, increasing their herd substantially. Yates supervised the construction of a larger barn, while Madeline applied her business acumen to establishing more favorable contracts for their cattle. Young Lucas, fully redeemed from his brief criminal past, developed a gift for working with horses and eventually became their trusted foreman. The Riley brothers stayed on, becoming like family as the years passed. In the fall of 1884, Madeline received word that her father had passed peacefully in his sleep. Though the news brought grief, it was tempered by the knowledge that they had reconciled, and that he had lived to see her happily established in her new life. That same month, Madeline discovered she was expecting their first child. When their son was born the following spring, a sturdy boy with his father's hazel eyes and his mother's determined expression, they named him Samuel, after the two men whose legacy had brought them together. 2 years later, a daughter joined the family, a spirited girl they called Elizabeth, after Madeline's mother. As the children grew, they absorbed the best of both their parents' worlds, Madeline's education and cultural refinements alongside Yates's practical knowledge of the land and animals. Through the years, the Turner Prescott Ranch became one of the most successful in the region. Madeline and Yates worked side by side through good seasons and bad, their partnership strengthening with each challenge they faced together. On their 20th wedding anniversary, as they sat on the porch of the expanded homestead that had replaced the original cabin, Madeline reflected on the journey that had brought them to this point. "You ever regret it?" she asked Yates, her hand comfortably entwined with his. "Taking a chance on an Easterner who didn't know one end of a cow from the other," Yates laughed, the lines around his eyes crinkling with amusement and affection. "Not for a single moment," he assured her. Best decision I ever made was helping that stubborn woman hiding behind a water trough." "I wasn't hiding," Madeline protested with mock indignation. "I was taking strategic cover." "Whatever you say, Mrs. Prescott." He leaned over to kiss her, still gentle after all these years. "I'm just grateful every day that you weren't like other women." "And I'm grateful you noticed," she replied softly, resting her head against his shoulder as the sun set over the mountains, painting their land their home in gold.